Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us again for another meetup. And as you can see, it's myself here. I'm just going to do the introductions, and then Schalk is going to be the speaker for this evening. Um, as usual, just a couple of things up front. So just to thank our sponsors, as always, our two recurring sponsors, NML and IO, both software development companies in Cape Town, who've been supporting us for a long time. And then just an upcoming event on the weekend of the 9th and 10th of April. We're having a weekend hackathon for a local community radio station called The Other Radio, just to help them out with their website that needs some love and attention. So it's built in React. There's obviously a lot of CSS. There's a CMS running on Django, and it's all deployed via Heroku. So we're looking for people who'd be interested in joining us for that. Who have skills in that area, although you don't necessarily need to. We also want to use it as a mentoring opportunity. So if any junior people or people want to pick up some skills in these areas would like to join us, you're more than welcome to. We will put out a call on the ZA Tech Slack around getting people to join us on the 9th and the 10th. Right, then as I mentioned, Schalk will be speaking to us today. I'm sure you all know who Schalk is from if you've attended any meetups in the past, co-founder of FEDSA, co-organizer of meetups, designer, front-end developer, teacher, father, all a huge list of things we can say about him. But yeah, enough from me. I'm just going to hand over to Schalk, and I hope you enjoy the talk from him today on web components. Please post any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll run through all of them at the end. Okay, over to you, Schalk.
Cool. So, hi everyone. Yeah, Justin, we should have probably prepared a blurb for me. I love how Justin just kind of winged that kind of at the heat of the moment. He just thought about okay, what are all the what are all the aspects of myself? Like, what would a blurb look like? So, well done. But yeah, so cool. So tonight I want to talk about web components, and I have spoken about it quite a bit. I also have an upcoming talk at DevConf this year on web components. And so for me, usually when I talk about topics, there's kind of almost like a bell curve. So I usually start out kind of researching a topic, creating some examples, whatever. And then as time goes on and I talk more about it, the content kind of grows and grows and grows. And, I have kind of a much more comprehensive, when I talk about it, a comprehensive overview of the topic. But, then usually past that point, as it continues growing and I kind of uncover more things and so forth, then I kind of get into the phase where I start to get rid of some stuff, otherwise the talk starts getting too long. I often joke that when Justin talks about typography, it needs to be like an entire Udemy course. And I think with some topics that I talk about, it's the same here. So I have a lot of stuff I want to kind of cover, or not I want to cover, that I have at hand. I'm maybe, as I go through it, going to kind of figure out what makes sense, what can I just quickly skip over, what can I gloss over. I tend to find that usually afterwards the feedback is that people would have liked to see more demos, more examples of me using web components, showing how they work and so forth. So I'm going to try and keep the kind of theoretical overview as kind of give it a bit more of a light touch. Cool. So let's talk about web components. You might have heard about web components. This might be the first time you're hearing about web components. You might kind of have heard about web components 5 years ago, or you might have heard about it by means of thinking about React or JavaScript frameworks or so forth. So just to kind of define what I mean by web components. So when I talk about web components, I don't mean components on the web by means of React and so forth. I mean web components, the actual API. So the native API in the browser that allows us to componentize logic and so forth. So cool. So let me just cover some brief concepts before I dig a bit deeper into that and maybe show some examples. Cool. So I think there's some three basic things I want to cover. Kind of what problem does web components solve for us? And kind of what do we mean when we say web components? Actually, there isn't. I mentioned web component API, which is actually incorrect. Like web components is actually a collection of APIs that kind of fall under this concept of web components. It's not like there's a web component dot, create or whatever. There isn't a specific web component API. It's loads of different APIs that kind of provide us with the means to create web components. And then I just want to talk about the shadow DOM. And like the shadow DOM is usually one of the things that's the hardest to get your head around, but it's to me it's the most powerful aspect of web components. Cool. So who knows who this is? Given that this is a stream, you guys can't answer. If this was an in-person event, you'd probably have someone who would say that this is Sir Tim Berners-Lee, creator of the internet. Also, another thing which we kind of forgot to mention, if you have any questions, ask them in the text chat. I'll maybe pause every now and then, and also maybe Justin can read some of the questions to me, and we can specifically speak about them. All right. So, okay, our starting point is Tim Berners-Lee, the actual creator of the internet. And interestingly enough, his website is still around. You can go to it, and it is exactly in the way that it should be, that the day it was published. And one of the reasons is kind of this web's adherence to backwards compatibility. Like this radical notion of backwards compatibility. If something's on the web, it shouldn't ever be broken. You shouldn't wake up one day and all of a sudden all the valid HTML that you wrote yesterday, they changed how divs work, or they changed how images work and so forth, and now it's broken. For obvious reasons, So, but that does present some problems, and I think like a lot of the shortcomings of web components is due to the fact that we need to adhere to this radical backwards compatibility. We can't just go and start with a blank slate and say, if we were to create some type of componentization model in the browser, how would that look like? We have to work on top of like the existing DOM API and loads of other things. Cool. But I think an important thing to note is that if you look at this first website and, the early web, it was kind of how was thought of, and specifically kind of in this, what is now called kind of the Web 1.0. This is maybe even before Web 1. This is maybe like Web Alpha or whatever. It was considered, if you think about ARPANET, all of those things, from its creation, it was considered as a means to kind of share academic documents. It was never really kind of anticipated as a means for software delivery. So in other words, for us to actually build things like Trello, like Figma, and so forth, it was essentially seen as, Google Docs. I think Wikipedia is a very good modern day equivalence of what the web was actually intended to be. But over time, we've kind of been able to hack things together, even using some things like floats and so forth with CSS. It wasn't even ever meant to kind of have a notion of two dimensions. It was meant to have a single dimension going downwards. And we kind of used floats and all of those things. So we've been very ingenious at kind of hacking things together in the web, kind of going against the grain of what it was created for. And, so through like magic itself, we've been able to hack together the ways to use the web as a means of software delivery. Granted, a lot of the times it needed to be done through things like back in the day with Knockout and Ember, Backbone.js, and more recently Vue and Angular and React and so forth. It was very hard to actually work with the web's API directly to kind of create like highly interactive, like highly like complex like software to be delivered to a user. But I think that time is definitely here. I remember a time where there used to be online versions of things. so you would get like an online kind of equivalence to Photoshop, or an online kind of, word processor or whatever, but those would be far inferior to kind of the actual one that you buy at like Incredible Connection and install the CD-ROM like onto your device. And I often joke and I say that if Trello was kind of conceived 10 years ago, it would be something that you would buy in a computer store and install. And I think the fact that if you look at Figma's market share at this day and age, just kind of how it's rocketing past like Sketch and Adobe XD and all of those things, it kind of speaks to this point where we've actually surpassed the point where things built in the browser aren't seen as kind of knockoffs or inferior to actual like the ones that are built with like C or whatever for a specific operating system, for a specific like for Mac OS or for Windows or so forth. And I think that's a very interesting point, and a very interesting point that we've reached. But obviously the tools have been very slow to catch up. And, but we've had kind of JavaScript libraries to kind of try and fill that gap between the way you would think about constructing software and building software, and kind of this notion of the DOM and the document in an HTML kind of page and what it allows you to do. So, I personally think web components is a good step in that direction. I think it was, like as a lot of things, it was very overhyped initially. I think people conceived it when it was announced, and in the early days they thought it was going to completely replace things like React and Angular and Vue and so forth. And it's just like that. I think we've kind of realized in retrospect that isn't possible without completely breaking just this radical backwards compatibility. And I think because of that, a lot of people were very disappointed by web components. And I think today we're kind of left with this question of given that web components are not here to replace React and all of those things, what do we use them for? Where might they be useful? And I think that's something that I've been very interested personally, and I've kind of read up quite a bit and kind of played around a bit. And also, I just find web components really interesting, despite the fact that most of my commercial work is done with big frameworks. I just there's something that I really like about this idea of just opening an HTML file, having a scripts.js, having a styles.css, and there is your web app. No build process, no webpack, no TypeScript, no nothing. That's really neat. I think it kind of reminds me of the early days of the web with GeoCities or whatever, where you just pop things up with an FTP, and that was it. Cool. So I don't want to go too deeply into this, but essentially, this idea of the web, there wasn't time tracking. There wasn't any. Let me just close that. There wasn't any kind of conflict in the web and what the web is meant to be used for. But I don't want to belabor this point too much, but if you've kind of followed Twitter, any conversation on the web in this day and age, it is just a dumpster fire. People just arguing over everything, from JavaScript to HTML to CSS. I think the specific example I have here is, some of you might remember, it is from an example where I think it was TikTok or whatever had a widget that you could embed or something, and they used a button over an A tag, and drama ensued. So I don't know if he's joining, Xandor, so you might be joining, but I really like a quote that he kind of mentioned to me once, where when he started out working, no one really knew what the web was, and everyone was trying to figure out what the web is and what you use it for, and nowadays everyone's trying to tell you what the web is and how you're using it wrong, and you're not using the web how it should be used, which I find interesting. Yeah, but essentially, you know, a lot of this comes from this notion of, we kind of started diverging into this idea of the web as a software delivery platform, and you know, it's just kind of been speeding up. This isn't necessarily to say that's what the web is for. A big part of the web is just purely for static documents still, but you know, a lot of people are looking at the web as a software delivery platform. Which kind of all started back in the day with Web 2.0. I don't want to go too much into it, but essentially we're kind of in this awkward phase where we're kind of between these two worlds, where this notion of the web as a software delivery platform hasn't been realized just yet. And so it's in what in academia you would call a liminal space, which is kind of like this weird place where you're kind of in between two different things. And you know, we have kind of experience with liminal spaces as humans. One of these is me. Take a guess. But you know, we have experience with liminal spaces as teenagers, where we're kind of halfway in between a child and halfway in between an adult. And in the same here, we're kind of in this weird space where we're kind of halfway in between. And you know, if you look to any teenagers or whatever, it's a very awkward place to be in. And the web is no different. Because, you know, essentially, you know, this is kind of the type of things people are building on the web nowadays. Even slides.com that I'm actually using to actually do the slideshow is essentially just HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Okay, so let's talk about web components and kind of how web components maybe seeks to be a first step in the direction of giving some tooling in terms of building this type of thing. So as mentioned, it's an umbrella term that covers a couple of different APIs. The three big ones is custom elements, HTML templates, and the shadow DOM. These are the official three APIs that are considered as part of web components. So custom elements, I'm going to quickly demo. That's essentially a way to create like your own HTML tags. Usually when I show people, especially students, this the first time, it's like magic, like this idea of creating your own HTML tags. And then there's HTML templates, which honestly I have yet to really find a really great use case for. I think they kind of, what I've seen like in cases where they've been quite useful is when you maybe have some server-side templating that, or maybe something like Webflow, where you create these templates and you kind of spit them out, and then the JavaScript just consumes them as templates instead of actually having your server-side language actually write inline JavaScript through like PHP or whatever, which I have seen, unfortunately. So I won't talk too much on that. I honestly don't find that much of a use for them. So the big ones for me is the shadow DOM and custom elements. But I also want to add two, which isn't officially considered part of web components, ES modules and constructible style sheets. So these definitely really help with this notion of kind of components and the componentization model for a page. ES modules I'll show. Unfortunately, constructible style sheets is still very much in the early days. The specification is changing quite a bit. I think it's on Chrome behind a flag, so I won't really go into it too much, but I think once we start getting constructible style sheets to be used in production, like that's going to be another big like game changer in the way we do web components. So I'm not going to be talking too much about that. So let's talk about custom elements. So custom elements, essentially, for those of you that know, there are native elements in JavaScript. So divs, buttons, lists, what else? Headers, divs, spans, and so forth. So these are ones that essentially that you can use that come shipped with the browser, and you can just stamp them out like cookies or whatever. But and these are done by means of kind of constructors. So there's a class that the DOM uses to construct these, which you can imagine like so you can create several instances of buttons or several instances of divs and so forth. So when it gets constructed, it has its own properties, and you can change those properties afterwards and so forth. And there's two ways to create elements, either through HTML, just passing a HTML string, and this gets passed by the browser into the elements in the document, and kind of provides us a way through the DOM to kind of interface with them. Or you can actually create them directly with the DOM. Both of these create them in the same way. But you can add your own ones. So in addition to all these ones that come standard, you can create your own ones. And this is by means of the window, custom element API. It's kind of on the window element itself. So you can define them, give it a name, and then just give it a class, and then you can call it like this. You can call it like any other element. One thing you'll notice, it has a hyphen in it. One of the rules of custom elements is that you always should have a hyphen, two separated words by a hyphen. The reason for that is because we don't know what's going to get added to HTML in the future. For example, you might create a custom element that's called Schalk or Justin or whatever, and then tomorrow the W3C in the infinite wisdom decides there's going to be a new component called Justin, and that's going to ship, that's going to be shipped in the newest version of Chrome. Now all of a sudden there's a conflict between this custom thing that you created and this new native thing that was added. So the W3C has kind of just committed themselves to never creating any new elements that are separated by a dash. There currently isn't any, and they won't ever add any. So if you have a dash separated HTML tag, it will never conflict with anything native in the browser. So because of that, this is a requirement for any custom elements. I'm not going to show this example right now. I'll rather show it in VS Code. Let me quickly just check. Justin, are there any questions?
Not at the moment, Schalk. Nothing right now.
Cool. All right. So then I just quickly want to chat about, I think one of the biggest things for me trying to get my head around is I see a lot of people kind of creating the markup inside their custom elements or the web components within HTML versus directly working with the actual DOM API. I'll quickly touch on the benefit and the drawbacks of each. So essentially, you can think of the inner element, HTML element. It's a lot more declarative, but the problem is that it kind of needs to be parsed all the time. So you can actually send HTML as a string to it, but it needs to be parsed all the time, so it has some performance implications. And then you can kind of construct it manually with the DOM, and that's a lot more performant, but it's a lot harder to read. So if someone were to look at your component, were to use your component, and so forth, and I'll maybe show, but kind of how I've kind of ended up, where I've kind of ended up in kind of drawing the line when to use this and when to not just work with the API directly. Because you don't want to, I see a lot of people who's accustomed to something like React immediately just inner HTMLing everything. The problem with that is every time it re-renders, it creates everything completely new. So you have no notion of, if you add an event listener and you re-render, it completely wipes all your event listeners. If you have any inputs, it unfocuses them because those inputs no longer exists because you're now creating a new one and so forth. But there is some benefit to, HTML is a very expressive language, so being able to parse HTML string is really useful. I did mention about the hyphens. And so I also want to quickly chat about the shadow DOM, which is essentially, it is like DOMs inside your DOM. So you have your DOM, which is the light DOM, but then you can have little encapsulated, smaller DOMs. You can almost think like iframes, but without all the problems associated with iframes and without having to be referencing another file. You can almost create these little self-contained little areas in your actual DOM, by means of shadow DOMs. So they're kind of hidden from the main DOM. Okay. And so, for example, here's an example of, so this concept of a shadow DOM actually has been in browsers for a very long time now, but we've only had native shadow DOM elements. So, for example, if we do audio controls and this, there's a lot of stuff that gets rendered here, but it's only by means of a single element. And the same here. this is a single element, but it renders all these things like, like this text, that button, that button has a hover. Where are all these things? And they're kind of behind it like a shadow DOM. So this is the only kind of API or interface that gets exposed to you. But behind that is loads of other things like buttons and text and so forth and so forth, and hover effects and so forth. But it's completely native, so you don't have any access to it. But essentially, the shadow DOM allows us to do the same thing. So in this case, where I would, for example, go Schalk element, it would maybe use that to create like some fancy thing that I created. Obviously, there is no Schalk element, so it just renders it like that for now. Similar to this, and we can pass it like things like theme, blue or whatever. Okay, so this is essentially, so the shadow DOM allows us to abstract all of this away behind a single element. Okay, so essentially we have this kind of OG DOM, the light DOM, which is completely global, which is what we've been using for a very long time before the shadow DOM. But now we kind of have these little DOMs that we can put inside the kind of our big light DOM. And they are kind of complete, you can have them be completely encapsulated from one another, so you don't have this problem of like global style. Like if you do like button red or whatever, it's going to turn every single button red in your entire HTML. Whereas you can kind of have styles, have actual query selectors, event listeners and things kind of encapsulated away into their own little DOMs. And the reason for that is, that allows us to abstract away low-level complexity. And the benefit of, abstracting that away is, for example, if you think about like your own house or whatever, you just have a light switch that you toggle on and off. You don't need to understand kind of how everything's wired to the light behind there, whatever, to use it. You just need to, all that you have to do is you need to know the switch this way, the light goes on, the switch that way, the light goes off. So that means first and foremost that we can kind of, it's a bit of a force multiplier. So if we're working with a team, if there's maybe a senior dev and some junior devs, the senior dev can create like all these web components that the junior devs can just use without understanding exactly even how it achieves what it achieves. And just even for yourself, trying to keep all this low-level logic in your head while you're making changes, there's a lot of like cognitive load. So sometimes it's just nice abstracting things away even for yourself and just knowing that, okay, I'm just working at the interface. I'm not concerned about the low-level logic. So for example, over here, so you kind of just you just abstract and encapsulate it away. And then lastly, I just want to talk about ES modules I mentioned. And ES modules are essentially, so this concept of having modules or components or whatever, it's kind of pretty critical in most programming languages. But because JavaScript started out as a scripting language, this notion of like little modules or reusable files or whatever wasn't really something that was kind of really considered. So we could use a script tag to load loads of different files. It had its own problems, being render blocking and so forth and so forth. The script tag has gotten a lot better over the years, but then we started looking at some ways to actually load modules. So the first one that was proposed was AMD, stands for, I think I might be wrong, asynchronous module definition or declaration, or I stand to be corrected, but that was a bit of a train smash. It didn't really pan out. This idea of loading like modules and things on the fly, the kind of the speeds that the web was at turned out to be a bit of a disaster. Sites became really slow, and so Node. So what happened is, we got Node, and Node had kind of that require, what you might know, kind of like that require, where you say const and a name and require and whatever, known as common JS. And, that was pretty successful, and it was actually ported to browsers by means of Browserify. All of this, if you're pretty new to kind of the world of JavaScript, all of this might be quite new to you, this might be the first time you're hearing about this, just know that it was quite a journey to kind of get to the point where we now have ES modules, you know. So we had this native thing, like this completely native script thing that we could use, but it was really weak, didn't afford us a lot. And then, you know, we had all these libraries and things that kind of artificially kind of provided the experience for us. And like now we're all full circle back to ES modules where, you know, we have this natively built in, but it's a lot stronger than like just the plain script tag. Yeah, and you might know this if you've been working with like React or whatever, any kind of Webpack thing, you might think this is something specific to React or specific to Angular or specific to Vue or whatever. It's or even TypeScript. This is actually native JavaScript. Yeah, you can use it right in the browser at this moment. Yeah, and so you can kind of like organize your components. So this really supercharges components for me, because now you can kind of arrange them into their own like files. All right, so now I maybe want to show a quick demo of how I would maybe build some web components and how I would use them. Before that, let me just check. Okay, asynchronous module definition, I see. Okay, cool. So someone kind of beat me to it. Someone's Google skills is a bit faster than mine. Cool, so let me just create a new folder. Let me just say web component talk. Okay, so let's create that folder and let's open it in VS Code. All right. So first and foremost, a couple of things for you, for those of you. So I'm exclusively using VS Code. Some of the things I'm going to be doing is purely just VS Code. Most of them have kind of alternatives in like WebStorm and so forth. But you should, if you want to kind of do the same in other IDEs, you should be able to find similar things. Maybe just hit Google a bit, but obviously VS Code is what I know, so I'm going to be illustrating it in VS Code. Also, if you just want to play around with this and you want to play around with it in VS Code is completely free, open source, so you can also just kind of play around with it if you want as well. All right, so first and foremost, let's create our index.html file. VS Code has emmet built in, so we can do HTML and click on that one, and it kind of does all of this for us. A lot of people don't actually know this. You should not be typing out HTML boilerplate in the year 2022. Okay, so let's say web components. Okay, and so let's just add a div. Hello world. Let's just see if all of this works. Let me just also zoom in a little bit more. This might be a bit intense, but you know, it might be better to see it this way. Maybe that's a bit better. Let me know if it is a bit too small and you can't see. So let's also do styles.css, and let's just box sizing, border box. You always add this. If you don't know what this is, just Google border box, box sizing. You always add this to the top of any CSS file. There's even an international border box day. So, you know, 1st of February, it's actually, it's passed already. So, yeah, believe it or not, there's actually, this is so common, you always include it at the top of any CSS. And then margin. So I just do these overrides. These are kind of the basic things I always do in my CSS. And once again, I can just do link, and let me just add that CSS file. Let's just add a quick, this is what I usually do just to check if it pulls through. I do live server in VS Code. It's an extension that you can install. This one, you'll see it has almost 20 million downloads. Yeah, really great. It just spins up an HTTP server for you, like using the folder. So I can just click there, go live. Okay, and let me just reload. And I think I have an actual service worker here running. Let me just unregister that service worker. There we go. Okay, there we go. Localhost, hello world, absolutely beautiful. Okay, best website I've ever created. Let me just put this on the side here. Do this. Okay, so all right, then so this works, and we have that. Let me just do this. Okay, cool. Let me zoom that in a bit more. All right, so our CSS, so let's just create our script. So I generally just have my scripts where I import everything and so forth. Then I usually have a components folder, and I do elements. Let's do a button. Okay, elements, button, JS, and let's also create a element button, and let's create a JSON file as well. Sometimes I actually just put it in a folder like this. Might even rename it to actual spec and component. Okay, so you might be wondering, what is this? Okay, so I'm going to show you something really cool with VS Code. I know that WebStorm has something similar, but this is what I do. So you can do settings on JSON. So for any JavaScript project, any VS Code project, you can set project-specific configs. And there is, might need to do some Googling quickly, custom HTML VS Code. So you can actually tell VS Code about any custom HTML that you add. So for example, yeah, then I just say where. So I give an array of all the JSON files that describe all the custom HTML that I'm adding. So this would be in components. If I add more components, I just add them here: element, button, and spec. All right, cool. So in here, let me just get the format. Okay. So let's copy that. Okay, I can get rid of the version. All right, so I just put the tags in here. So name. Okay, so this component is element button. What is it? Allows users to indicate an action by pressing a button. Okay, best description ever. Then references, I don't want references. What I do want is attributes, I think. Let me just see. Do they have an example here? I know there is a... So for what it's worth, there is an actual I'm not sure where it is, but there is a specification to create a standardized custom data. So something like this that can be used by any IDEs. I think there is a committee that is working on something like that. But you know, it's still in the works. So I just specifically do the VS Code one. Let me just see VS Code HTML custom data. Let me just see if I can find a quick HTML example. Here. There's some examples. Oops, this one, custom data sample. So you can just have a look here. And references, there we go. Yeah, it was attributes. So let me just copy that. Okay, let's add attributes. Okay, so name. So what do we want to add to the button? So let's say what we want to do is we want to have importance, and importance can be let's say determines the visual salience. Okay, like whether it's a primary call to action or whatever, and we can have two for them. So name, so we just have primary. It can be primary or it can be secondary. Okay, cool. So now I want to show you. So we have the specification. So this is actually the documentation for our button as well. It doubles as the documentation. Because we are pulling it in over here, like which one we can. So let's go with primary. And even if you hover over it, you know, it tells you what it is. In the same way that if you were to do class, you know, it tells you what is a class, you know, and so forth. Obviously, I just wrote something quickly, so theirs is a lot more, you know, comprehensive. Cool. So, and let's just put something in there. Let's say click me. All right. So currently it doesn't do anything. Let me just get rid of this. So currently, and it's because like it doesn't understand like element button. It doesn't know what that is because we haven't created that component yet. You know, and how HTML works, if it doesn't understand something similar to CSS, it just like creates a basic element like with that. Because it assumes, oh, this is maybe something that was added in future versions of the browser. This version of the browser just doesn't understand it yet. The same with CSS, you know. So if you know anything about progressive enhancement and so forth, it's kind of built on this principle. I don't want to go too much into that. Cool. So let us import our components, element button, and just the component itself. Cool. So importing that. Let us also just load this file. So we're already loading the CSS, script, source, and components, element button. No, man, what am I doing? Just the scripts. Okay. And we need to tell it two things. So we need to say defer. So you might have seen people actually add the script here at the bottom. This is a much better way of doing it. More modern way. Defer just tells it wait for all of this to complete, all the HTML before running this. And in order to actually use, so you'll see now if we run it, if I look at my console, it's going to give me an error. It says cannot use import statements outside a module. So we just need to say type module. All right, so if we want to use kind of import statements. All right, so we have this empty file. It doesn't do anything. Let's just do a console log and see if it works. Okay, console. So there we go. Okay, it works. All right, so let us create our, let's see if there are any text questions. Cool. Doesn't seem that way. Okay, so let's create, so let's say class. And let's just create the component. You don't need to call this component. You can call it anything, but it needs to extend HTML elements. So HTML element is kind of like the base vanilla JavaScript element that you can extend. You can extend, for example, in this case, we might want to extend, you know, the button element, like to have it be more specific, have it be more semantic. But the problem is Safari, looking at you, Safari at this moment, like has a lot of problems when you try and extend existing things. So at this moment, it's safer, like when you actually take Safari into account, to just extend kind of vanilla. So if you know anything about classes in JavaScript, you just do the constructor. You would call this super. The reason why I would call super is just so you run any actual constructed things on this HTML element itself. I think it gives a warning if you don't do that. I might be mistaken. Let me just pull this down here. Oh no, it doesn't. I don't know why I thought it gives a warning if you don't do that. Okay, but anyway, so you need to call that. And then there are a couple of lifecycle things. If you've worked with like older versions of React, like with the class API, it's very similar actually. So I'm not going to go over all of them. We don't have enough time. But the primary two I want to kind of talk about now is connected callback and disconnected callback. Okay, so connected callback. So if I do console log, reload. Okay. So I've created this class and now I need to assign it to an actual custom element. So this is now able to create a DOM object for me. You know, so in the same way that if we were to go in our browser here and we would say, let's say document query selector body or whatever. Yeah. document, I think. What am I doing? Document, body, cool. So there, this thing, you know, I think you can get the actual DOM representation of it by going. Yeah. So, you know, this is this object that the native class constructor creates for us. So we need to create our own class constructor here. So we first do, so on the window, because it's global, you can just do custom element. I prefer to just do window custom element just to make it more deliberate. Define, and what was that? Element button. Okay, and then we just pass component to it. All right, so reload. Okay, so this fires. Okay, so what we want to do is, first and foremost, we want to create a shadow DOM for this. So we can just go shadow, and this append child, okay, and then mode. So we can have it be open and closed. Mode. Oh, not append child, append attach shadow. Okay. I prefer to just always do closed. Closed means that like you can't from outside this component go into this and kind of change things here, which to me is the whole point of web components. But if you do open, you can reach inside it from outside, from the main DOM. Okay, so then what we can do is shadow. So this shadow on the component, inner HTML. And let's just set that to div. Okay, and there we go. There is our component. So this is, so at the moment, this is, so wherever we call our component, no matter what, so if we just have this, it creates that. If we have another one, so we've just created our first component. It just says, okay, but so let's go back to this. We also maybe want a version of it with secondary. So importance primary, importance secondary. So both of them now do that. Okay, so another thing we want to do as well, so what's quite common, so when we talk about buttons, oftentimes like it's actually href, like it's either, you know, an actual semantic button, or it is you know, a tag. But you know, most of the time when we're talking about buttons, we don't necessarily mean like semantic, we mean like something that just performs an action. So you can have this and just apply like class, you know, so for example, something like Bootstrap, you would just apply the class button to it and it wouldn't care whether it's an A or a button. But we can actually build this in here. So we can say that if, you know, if there is an href, so let's just say, you know, https google.com. Okay, so if there is an href, then treat it as an actual A tag, otherwise treat it as a button. Okay, we also run prettier. All right, so now in here, so first and foremost, what I can do is, so connected callback is when it actually renders this. Don't put, actually try and do anything with it in the constructor, because here it's still just in memory. You don't have the shadow DOM right yet. So this only fires when it gets added to the actual DOM. Likewise, this gets fired when it gets removed from the DOM. And this will be important in a second. So first and foremost, what we want to do is, what we can do is we can say if, okay, so first let's get, so we can say const href this. So this always refers to the host. This shadow refers to the inside of the web component. So this always refers to the thing that created it. So this. So we can say this href. Okay. Does not exist in component. Oh, get attribute. So let's get the attribute href. So, and we can say if there is an href, then, okay, so another thing as well that we can do is whatever gets passed inside it. So yeah, let's just do click me for all of them. Oops. Okay, what am I? Oh, that needs to be closed. Okay, so whatever gets passed in it, so we can tell it where to go. So we can just do slot. Okay, and you'll see then whatever gets passed is going to be rendered where slot is. So we can say if href. Okay, so now, so if it's an href, do an a tag, and we can also use backticks to do interpolation. Okay, so we can do href, and let's just do interpolation here. So put the actual href in there. Otherwise, just make it a button. All right, cool. So now we already have that. So you can see now based on whether there's an href or not, it gets rendered as a button or it gets rendered as a link. But obviously we want to kind of unify that a bit. Okay, so here's another thing. So the problem is, you know, you might expect that we can do this, you know. But here's the thing, this is completely encapsulated from the global light DOM. And that's a good thing. But the problem is we can't style it directly from the CSS. So we can only do it inside the component itself. And you know, this is where constructible style sheets comes in that I spoke about. But for now, the best way to do that is literally just to have an inline style tag. Yeah, if you've kind of been writing HTML for a while, you might you might kind of recognize that that was usually considered bad practice. But with web components, it's at the moment the kind of the most common way to actually add styling. So what we can do is, so I would maybe just do const styles and then just backticks. And I would do style, and let's just create like a, let's just say button class here, and then say background red. Okay, so then let's just attach the button class over here. Okay, and we need to then also include that. Regardless of which one we return, we need to just include that in our markup. Cool. So you'll see now, regardless. I'm just going to copy some existing button styling that I have, just so I don't spend this actual talk styling, or like spending the majority of this talk styling an actual button. Let me just see if I can find it. All right, so let's go back here. So you might, so good news is though, that you might, so there's a couple of things that can actually pierce the shadow DOM. And so one of them, some of them are pretty strange. So for example, font family, you'll see it actually is able to pierce the shadow DOM. So there were a couple of exceptions made for like this type of thing. Strangely enough, this doesn't pierce the shadow DOM. So you need to include this in your actual components. Yeah, I don't really understand the logic there, how font family pierces the shadow DOM, but this you need to set every time for each of your components, regardless. Another thing that like pierces the shadow DOM, which is really cool, is CSS Variables. You might know about these. So let me just add them. So yeah, if you have CSS Variables, they actually pierce the shadow DOM. So for example, what we can do is we can go button and we can do bar, so we can do RGB. This is the way I usually do my variables. I'm not going to go too much into depth in terms of kind of my conventions, but yeah, you'll see like this actually pierces the shadow. So this makes our lives a bit easier. So another thing I haven't spoken up until now is, so obviously this starts getting a bit frustrating if you're just working with these things as strings. So something that I have been doing now for a while is I just have a utility file. So let's say utils, just html.js. And what I do is let me just get the code for that. I just use this. So essentially, I will share this in the meetup event if anyone wants to use this. So essentially what this does is it accepts an HTML like template literal, and you can type, you know, and you'll see it does actual syntax highlighting. And that is because I have lit HTML. So lit HTML kind of does this. And so if you install the extension, you see it's quite popular, then you actually get syntax highlighting, whether you're using lit HTML or not. As long as you have HTML, as long as you have a function called HTML that you use on your template literal. So for example, if I import this now, so you see this gets exported from the file. So if I import from utils html.js, and I do this, and I put that, so you'll see now we get syntax highlighting, which is really neat. And furthermore, like all things like prettier and whatever also get, so if I kind of mess up the styling, like, and I run prettier, so if I go, you know, right click, format document, it actually parses that as CSS and as actual HTML. So that's really neat. But this also, so the specific function that I use does another thing as well. So something that I've become pretty accustomed to in the world of React is kind of conditional renders. So, you know, what I can do is I can say maybe if true, so I have maybe something like, let me just const example is, you know, true or whatever. Okay, so then I can say if example and you know div it is true. So if any template literal ever return, if an interpolation inside a template literal returns false, it doesn't render anything. Without this kind of function, it would like output the actual word false. So yeah, this like it's just a kind of a quality of life thing that I've added to this HTML. But this HTML is just a function that I wrote myself. You can literally just have it, you know, return the string or exactly as it is. But like the extension that I'm using just recognizes this HTML in order to apply the syntax highlighting. So if I do that, I don't get it anymore. Cool, let me check if there are any questions. Cool, doesn't seem that way. All right, so let's continue. Okay, cool, so we have this now. Let me just copy some styling from an existing thing that I have. So, components. Okay, so I have the style map. Okay, so let me first copy that. So generally, what I tend to do, if logic becomes kind of very forking, like a lot of like kind of forked conditionals and whatever, I actually just write the values like this as an actual map, and then I just, so I'll show you what I then do, because this is a lot easier to kind of understand. So if it's light and it's primary, this is all the values. If it's light and it's secondary, these are all the values. If it's dark, it's primary, these. Instead of having like all these nested like if statements, I tend to do the same in React with things like styled components and so forth as well. So if I get the rest of it, so here is the actual HTML that I use. Okay, so, oops. All right, so let me just add that. So this is, there we go. So you will see over here that now I just use this map, and based on kind of attributes, I just actually get the correct value. So obviously we don't have theme, we don't have importance and all of those things. So let's quickly just add it to our specification. So let's add a name. Theme and description, and let's just say determines or indicates whether it will be placed on a dark or light background. Okay, and then values, so just light and dark. Okay, what else do I have in here in my component? So okay, let's get, so I have a couple of things. So we already grabbed the href. Let's get theme, let's get importance. So let's get attribute importance, theme. Okay, there we go. So, right, so now we have that important theme. Let's also set some defaults for them. So importance, if it isn't declared, use light. If, oh no, sorry, yeah, use light. Other with importance, use secondary as the basic one. Okay, and you'll see here we actually start getting our styling already. So this. So here are our buttons. So you can see, so the two bottom ones are actually actual links, and the top ones are actual buttons. So if you click them, they don't do anything because they're semantically in the HTML buttons, but these two are actual links because they have an href. So if you click them, it goes to that href. Yeah, so just from this alone, so we can just have element, button, whatever, and now because we've added theme as well, you know, we can get auto, and it just tells us what theme does. Cool. So let us continue with that. So href, theme, importance, and yeah, so if we were to use this on a dark background as well, so let me have some examples over here. So we can just do a div, and let's do style, yeah, some inline styles. Just want to illustrate the principle. Obviously you don't want to write inline styles in your actual HTML files. And if we set, you know, theme to dark. Cool. Wait, I messed something up here. Alright, so over there, let's also just add a bit of padding so you can see. Cool. So that is when it's dark. So obviously if it's not dark themed, then it's going to be a bit weird. So this is specifically for dark. Let's actually just set it to the background to blue. So you have inverse. Let's see. That should actually be white. I think I messed up. That should actually be white. So that's easy to change. Let's go into our component, and that's why this is actually pretty cool, because now I can just go, okay, so it's dark, secondary, the border is color white. Why is the secondary one dark? Background color white, none. Not sure why this is happening. Okay, but I'm not gonna try and figure it out now, but in theory, so let's just remove the secondary one because the styling is a bit not cool, but this one is cool. Alright, so obviously we don't have any hovers here, none of that. So what we want to do is let's check in our component. Do we not have hover states? Let's see. So in our styles, loading loader, button. Oh, these need to be renamed. Okay. Cool. So now we have some hover states as well. That's just using the variables. Okay. So like the nice thing, because this pierces the shadow DOM, if we were to change blue to anything else, let's say whatever this color is, now it updates everything. Okay. So this is actually pretty cool because this pierces all your shadow DOMs. So this is like global design tokens. Okay. Right. So one more thing I want to show is you'll see here I have another thing that I use quite a bit as well, which is just like kind of a custom thing that I built myself. Also like a small little utility function is kind of this class list function. Let's just put it here inside the let's just do it as a class list .js. Export it, and that just allows me to dynamically determine what classes to apply to HTML without it becoming a mess. So what I can just do is I can just do const, let's do button styles. Okay, and then I just need to import class list. Okay, utils class list, and so that you see you'll see it also uses JSDoc to kind of tell you what it needs. So obviously a button, but then we want another thing, so a loading class as well that is only applied if the loading variable is true. So this one is always true. So button is always true. This one is only if loading is true, but loading doesn't exist yet, so it's not going to work. And then this just transforms it for me into kind of the CSS for the classes, like that. Okay. So there we go. Same here. All right. Okay, so obviously this breaks because loading. So what we can do is we can also get const loading, and we can just do this get. So loading is a Boolean. So weirdly enough, with HTML, you need to just check for an empty string, or more safe, check if it's not undefined. Okay, so loading is true if there's an attribute loading. So this should, let me just see. Okay, did I pass loading? No, I didn't. So loading is true if this is not undefined. Okay, so generally you can also just do this. Okay, I might need to check that to see why that. Unless it's maybe like null or oh, I think it's false maybe. Is not false. Okay. Well, let's just make our lives easier. Let's just see what it is. Console log loading. So if we don't pass it, it is null. Okay, so if it's not null, then it is effectively true. Okay, so we haven't passed it to any of these, so let's create and let's also, just to keep our documentation up to date, let's do name and loading, and description, whether to overlay a spinner on top of the button. Okay, so this is kind of like if something is loading or whatever. And values, it doesn't have any values because it is just essentially a Boolean. So it can just be there or it can not be there. So you don't assign a value to it. So yeah, once again, if we now start typing, it's going to auto complete for us, and we can just include it like that. Okay, and you'll see now the text is gone immediately, but we need to also have the spinner show. So what we can do is if we do component, so loading, so at the moment we are adding the button styles. Let's also just do the loader styles, and let's just create a loading element inside it. Okay, let's just call it div class. Let's just apply the loading styles or loader styles. Okay, and the same here, whether it's a button or a link, it doesn't matter. Okay, whoops. And so this should be loader, and the same here, it has a modifier, so you'll see over here a loader is loading. So loader doesn't show by default, it's display none unless you add the loading class, then it's display flex. Cool, so those are now automatically loading. If you also here add loading, that one starts loading as well. Cool, so last thing I quickly want to touch on is actually like using events within these. So you can treat these as any regular elements. So what we can do is we can go into this and we can say, let's say const, and let's just get buttons. So let's do document query selector all, and we can just actually search for element button. All right, and obviously, so we need to just convert it into an array because otherwise it's going to be a node list. And console log buttons. So let's have a look and look at my console. Okay, let's just get rid of. So in here we have console log somewhere there. Okay, so here it just logs it like you would with a div or whatever. So let's say we want to manually set loading afterwards. So let's say when you click on this one, so let's actually, instead of getting all of them, let's get the first one, so the top one. Okay, so not select all and just button. And let's do button add event listener, and let's say click. When you click on that one, console log something. Okay, let me just detach this. Okay, so you'll see if we click it. Okay, so you can add event listeners to your actual custom things. But so what we want is let event, so let's get the actual source of the event. So let's do, oops, const target. Yeah, I don't want to go on for too much longer, so I just maybe want to show this in brief. So target, and then you would assume you would go like target loading true. Okay, it says that because I need to actually in my custom specification for this actually include events as well, and properties. Let me just quickly see. So properties, what's it, HTML, the custom HTML VS Code properties. Let me also show you something neat. So someone actually built a web view API that you, oh no, where is it? A web component API viewer that actually allows you to, if you've used like Storybook or something like that, it allows you to kind of see your own components, see the APIs and whatever in this manner. It's really cool. So for example, we can do like demo, and we can kind of demo our components. So like in the example, they have like a fancy accordion, a progress bar, or whatever. So this is kind of draws a lot of inspiration from Storybook. So you can go source, you can play around with it, see how it works. So the knobs, events, and so forth, you can change these. So let's go to the expansion panel. So the knobs, so this is how it works if it's disabled, so you can actually play with it. If it's opened, the header, you can change it to whatever you want. the content inside. So you can see as you change that, like what you pass to that custom component, even text from right to left or whatever, seeing, you know, how it gets changed. It's really cool. Even styles, you can say, okay, so if I were to, you know, do, that's how it would look, you know, and if the text and so forth. Yeah, it's really cool. You can even see the events that get fired. And the actual code. This is really neat. I don't have enough time to really go into this, but this is the API viewer, and this is a web component itself, which is really cool. Yeah, so you can just include it as a with CDN. Cool. So then, okay, so loading. Oh, sorry, I just completely went on a tangent there. HTML, custom data, VS Code, property. Let me just see how I set properties. Custom data format. HTML custom data. Okay, so here's an example. Global attributes, yeah, value sets. I think what is value sets? Maybe the properties. Additional properties are. Oh wait, name, description, tags. Yeah, I can't remember what this is. I just generally copy from previous projects. It might be. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. Like VS Code is just going to complain that this doesn't exist on that thing, but that's okay. If we really want, we can just think you can do ts ignore. Oh no, never mind. Okay, so you would expect now if we click it, then it would. So let's just actually make sure it fires. That it would actually now set it to loading. Okay, so it fires. The target loading, we're setting it to true. And the reason being, once again, I did mention, you know, because we set the mode to closed, we need to deliberately set getters and setters. Like you can't reach in without like actually providing API endpoints. So maybe even if we just console log that this current value of target loading when it gets clicked, so console. So undefined, it should actually not be undefined, it should be true. But obviously after that, when we click it, it's set to true. So like you just need to set our own getters and setters. So we would say set loading, okay, and the value, and let's just console log the value back, and getters get loading just this dot loading. If it doesn't exist, then just return false. Okay. Get. Oh, there we go. Cool. So now, if we look at this console log, oops, what is going on over here? Maximum call stack. Ooh, yeah, no, that doesn't look good. Oh, okay. What did I mess up? This loading. Oh, we're actually accessing it. Okay, that's fine. So we can maybe just set it so we can just, when it connects, we can just set the loading on the component itself to whatever we get from the data attribute. And okay, so now if we reload, console log value set shouldn't log. Where does it come from? So this was really nice about not having a bold step or whatever. You can literally just go directly to the code. Set loading. Oh, it's because when we set it, it actually, there's the problem. And because we set it when it initializes, okay, so we actually don't want to do that. So yeah, so I don't want to take up too much time, but essentially what this allows, let's just do a hacky version like this, where it just returns false. Okay. So you can influence what gets returned and when it gets set. So now if I click on it, it's just going to return false. Okay, I'm making a mess now. But regardless, so the main point is what I would usually do is I would just set it. So a lot of people say that you need to kind of mirror your props and because by default this doesn't get set as a prop unless you actually deliberately do it. So you need to kind of mirror these values as actual props themselves as well. So let's just get rid of the setting and so forth. So now I can go into my code example and I can check what's the state of loading, check what's the href, theme, and once again I didn't set these as properties in the in this definition, so it's not going to reflect as such, but once again these are just warnings. What was that one? Importance. Okay, so now if we inspect console log, we click it, cool, now we get all the values because it's set as actual properties. And then what you can do is you can set side effects. So if I say target loading equals true, if I set it to true, then in the component itself I can use a setter to say set loading. Let me just see if I can quickly do this one. So what we obviously then want to do, what we obviously then want to do is then we want to add these classes if it gets set to true. So what we can do is so we can go this shadow query selector and what do we want? So we want to look for the class loader, and we want to look for the class button. Okay, let's just get them. Oops. Just want to show this last little piece because with this, you can basically build anything you want with web components. Okay, so let's have a quick look. Okay, so it gets them. So what we then want to do is we just want to we want to add the loading class, so class list add loading. So we just want to add loading to both of them whenever loading is set to true. So this is only if value is true. Oh well, we can just do an existential condition like that. Else, if it's not true, then remove it actually, and we can take this outside of that. So let's just do remove. Ooh, what did I do now? Let's see. Cannot read properties null reading class list as component set loading as loading. What am I missing here? Let me just comment that. Okay, let me see. Just console log loader class list. So I think it might be also because the mode is closed. Let me just quickly check. Yeah, so it's not too happy. Oh wait, it just found it like a second ago. Oh, interesting. Oh, okay. It's because we are actually calling it. Okay, I get what's going on here. So if those don't exist yet, don't cause any side effects. So if the button doesn't exist and the loader doesn't exist, just return. Okay. Otherwise, okay, it's because, you know, this is where getters and setters become tricky, because we are actually, or we're kind of setting it over here. So this fires even like before the HTML has been added yet, which is why they don't exist. So in that case, when it fires and we set it, like just skip it if they don't exist yet. Now, otherwise, if it exists already, then do this. So now if we go inspect console, click, and it starts loading. Okay, that's pretty cool. So, you know, if you tell someone that, hey, just like import this, this JavaScript file. So just this file. It is quite a meaty one, about 200 lines, but you get all this behavior. So you'll get a custom element. You can set the importance. By default, it's secondary. We can set the importance to primary. There we go. We can set it to a dark theme or a light theme. So let's just add some padding on here. 1 rem, just so the button is a bit clearer. So you can see there's a bit of a click animation as well. And we have this event listener that we wired up here. That, so if you just set, so let's say even before the click, we can just say button loading true. So if we set it to true, you know, but alternatively, let's say we set it to false if you click it. There you go. So yeah, like you now have like a really interactive like HTML element, web component that you just import with this. And if you have like this file, then you should even get like, you know, documentation. So what does it do? And like, you know, if we go loading, it auto completes. It also tells what does loading do if we set it, and so forth. Cool. So that, you know, like there is so much to kind of talk about that like I can barely touch on all of this. Maybe I can chat very briefly to some questions. Justin, I don't know if there are like any questions.
Yes, there's one.
Okay.
I've added it.
Okay.
Having to include styles and components is a major flaw in my honest opinion. The point of CSS was to separate form and function.
I'm probably going to
And
get
there is
a
a
lot of
response to that, which I'll also show.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, okay.
But
Someone already did the work for me.
Styles. The inline styles sucks, but I suppose the constructed style sheets will take care of that.
Correctly. Yes, correct. So constructed style sheets will kind of solve a lot of this. Also, it's important to note that with this, browsers are pretty smart enough to kind of do what's called deduping. So in other words, if you have a script tag, so if you have 2 script tags, inline script tags that are like both, you know, button, background, red, not script style tags. So browsers are smart enough that like it's gonna dedupe these and it's just gonna run it once because it's gonna recognize that it's the same one. So at the very least, if you have 20 buttons that have that style built in, then it is, you know, it's only gonna do it once. And also, but you will see that what I have some conditional logic in my like inline styles. And like to me, the like kind of the performance hit is really minor there. I think you start looking at performance issues when a component is re-rendering. When you are like determining the styles dynamically when it gets created, because it's already parsing all of this, it's parsing the HTML and so forth. Oh, actually, that's actually the follow-up question. Yeah. So if it's exactly the same, so if I don't have any like kind of any of this like dynamic interpolation, like it dedupes it, so it treats it as the same thing. It doesn't it doesn't even parse it. It can see the string is the same as like another style string. Browsers are smart enough to do that, but obviously now, because I'm doing a bit of interpolation, I'm dynamically adding things. That's going to be a style sheet with different content than the other one. So these are going to get parsed individually, but because this only gets parsed when the component gets created, like I just take that super small like initial performance hit. Performance becomes a problem when, if for example, every time you change something, like you kind of rebuild the entire style inline style tag, but now it's already in the kind of, what is it, the OCSS, like the CSS version of the DOM. Justin, maybe you can help me out here.
CSS
the SOM. It's already in there, so like now anything that happens afterwards has absolutely no effect. So you take a very small performance hit, but we're here like in the level of whether you should do a reduce or a for loop. This is like like to quote Kent Beck, make it work, make it right, make it fast. The level of difference in performance here is so minor. I think we forget that actually browsers, and specifically JavaScript, is built to actually parse numbers and calculate things. Things get slow when you are continually like reflowing the DOM and stuff like that. So you don't necessarily get that big of a performance hit here. And the one that you do get, I find, is small enough. You always make this trade-off between kind of the declarativeness and readability compared to so for example, I can very much do this by directly going document, create element or whatever, but I lose that readability. Now at a glance you can see what this component is. If I have like all these imperative like statements, it becomes a lot harder to actually see what gets rendered, especially if there's like branching logic. So it's a trade-off. For me, like on the initial render, like that trade-off is so small, I don't mind. But if you're starting to kind of rebuild the CSS or rebuild the HTML, like when something updates, like that is because you can have several updates fire in the same second. Then we're kind of looking at a problem, which is why, for example, with things like with the setters, I just actually manually go and use class list and whatever, and just manipulate the DOM directly, so I don't re-render the entire thing. I hope that answers the question. So initially, so I also maybe want to give some, like, I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but like in the words of Martin Luther, like, here I stand, I can do no other. I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but I actually would give a bit of pushback in terms of that initial notion of separating form and function, or what's it, style. Well, style. So the main notion is like HTML is for like content, CSS is for like style, and JavaScript is for interactivity. I don't think we ever really reached that. I think that was kind of a nice idea, but like you couldn't like CSS is so dependent on your HTML. You needed to add the classes, and so forth. It was like, and even things like headers and footers. Now, obviously, with grid, with Fleckfox, we started getting a bit of this. With grid, like, we're kind of getting it in its truest form. But before grid, the way you wrote your HTML very much influenced like the way it's going to be styled. like there was a reason why you put your header at the top of your HTML file. There's a reason you put your footer at the bottom of the HTML file, because that influences where things go. So we were never really kind of able to separate kind of content from style. And and the same with interactivity and so forth. At what point does it go from interactivity with JavaScript to actually just outputting HTML? If you are like doing any serious DOM manipulations, at some point you're actually controlling the content now. You're not just adding enhancements on top of that. But regardless, unfortunately, you can't. So here's one thing that you can do. You can do component CSS. So maybe this kind of makes it a bit more palatable. So maybe put that in there. Obviously, then this is not going to work. But let's say button background red, and then you can import it here. With the caveat being that it's, you're going to have to, I don't even know whether this is even worse. I might think that this is getting worse. Yeah, but you can do that. And now you have an extra HTTP request. So
yeah,
it's just,
and a separate file to maintain.
Exactly. So I don't know. Like, to me, Inline Styles is the least worst one at the moment. There isn't really any other way to do it without breaking encapsulation. And encapsulation is the whole point. So you don't want, if I pull in this component.js file into a project, I don't want anything that I'm doing in here, except if it's actually variables, to accidentally, I don't want to go element, button, background, red, and accidentally override the logic inside this. So I don't know. This is kind of where what I spoke about earlier with kind of this radical commitment to backwards compatibility really starts becoming tough. Because now we need to use the existing system in a way that was never created for. CSS was created in a time where you had a document and you set the title, like very much the way you would do a style in Microsoft Word for a document or something, like a master document.
Yeah. And so that's where that separation of concerns notion comes from as well. It's very much of a kind of monolithic page of HTML elements that are largely textual in nature. There's another comment, Schalk.
Yes. Go ahead.
This was related back to the performance and duplication discussion. This duplication is also duplication in terms of file size, which is cool. Whereas build frameworks do actual file size duplication for scope styles. So it's nice for download performance. Your thoughts on that?
So first and foremost, let me just stop sharing. So I can put this in my main monitor, so I can look at the camera instead of what I'm demoing. So let me just see. So I think one thing we need to be mindful of here is that kilobytes are not the same as kilobytes. There's different types of bytes. I think, who was it? Adi Osmani wrote that article about JavaScript being byte for byte the most expensive thing you can download. So 1 megabyte of JavaScript is not the same as 1 megabyte of a PNG or whatever. That kind of sounds like it actually disproves my point. Not in terms of file size. Okay. Okay, so I'm not 100% sure what the question is getting at. But I think it's just worth mentioning that parsing is a bigger issue. So like 100, 200, 300, 500 lines of CSS is, is not necessarily the same as like a library that would kind of like abstract all of that away, and it would actually have to run it through like some type of runtime parser that the library has. So duplication like you shouldn't look at file size alone. It's actually, it's possible that you can, usually file size is a proxy for kind of like how heavy like the parsing is, because it just means usually more things to parse. But we shouldn't like see those things as being equal. Like you can have a big file that like gets parsed really quickly, and you can have a small file that has a lot of recursion or whatever, that's like a couple of bytes, but like takes 10 minutes for the browser to parse before it can show anything.
Yeah.
So I think that is just.
I don't know if you saw. It's not. I think it's in Chrome, Canary maybe, but the prefetch API is now allowing you to add priority.
Oh, nice.
So browser makers are thinking about all these things, that now we tend to be loading more files and so on, and bundling and doing code splitting and all that kind of stuff. So for example, that okay, I'm going to use an awful example because I hate them, but a carousel, right? When people land on your page, that you want that first image in that carousel to load immediately.
But not all the ones that still.
Not all of them, right? So you can add a priority to the first one.
That's really cool.
And you can do that for all your scripts, your CSS files, any kind of things that need to load. So the way performance is moving in parallel with other developments in browsers, I don't think this is going to be much of an issue for much longer, because if we can do that.
And also, if you're doing like, so I would like imagine like if you're building any type of web app, to which this type of thing is very applicable. Web components, useful, but not that useful for like plain like read-only kind of like digital brochure type sites. For kind of web apps, they're really nice. Then you're probably already doing like service workers and things. So like that becomes less of an issue when we start getting into this world where you have this notion of actually installing a web app on your computer. Like I've definitely built things with web components and service workers without any build process, just raw HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you can actually install on your computer as actual software. But one thing I've been wanting to try out is, so Microsoft and Google are co-maintaining a tool that allows you to convert service worker, a progressive web app, into an actual Android app that you can put on the Play Store. It's co-maintained by Microsoft, so it creates an APK for you from it. I haven't had time to play around with it, but sure, like that, I want to do that so badly. This, like, to me, this notion of just having an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file, having those 3 files, and now you actually have something you can actually push to the Play Store, is just like, like what?
Yeah.
Like there's no React Native, there's no like Ionic or whatever. So that's kind of a very interesting kind of thing that's on the horizon.
As usual, Safari is the problem.
Yeah.
There was a question from Johan, but I think, Johan, you were referring to the prefetch and priority. So prefetch is available in all browsers except the one we don't like to mention, which is Safari.
Unless you're me, then I mention it all the time.
Yeah.
And I am like, I'm very conflicted. Yeah, sorry, finish first, Justin. Like,
no, I just wanted to say that prefetch is available everywhere except Safari on both OS and iOS, but the priority specification is not implemented anywhere yet. It is being worked on.
Yeah. So I'm very conflicted because I kind of like Jen Simmons is like one of my heroes. And now she's kind of leading up the Safari team, and at one point on Twitter she kind of asked publicly, hey, can people tell me what, like, questions about Safari or what they want to see changed or what they're unhappy about? And I actually tweeted at her and I was like, oh man, this is amazing, like this is the new Safari, and I'm still waiting on an answer to that tweet. And it's also awkward because an Apple employee actually liked my tweet, one of the Safari team members, but she didn't respond. So I don't know. I'm very conflicted now. I guess it's what's that thing about you? You either die young or you live long enough to kind of fall from grace.
To become the villain,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
and I'm saying this like I really like I'm kind of joking mostly, but I really admire Jen Simmons.
no, me too.
Sorry, not that much.
So it looks like I misunderstood Johan's comment. Is that you just do this natively in the browser with
Yeah.
components. You don't need any framework or anything. So yeah,
No npm, no node, no
nothing.
scripts, no nothing. Yeah, this is 100%. Everything I did here is fully supported in native. You'll see. The only things I'm pulling in is my styles.css and scripts.js.
Yeah.
So
It's all just vanilla ES6.
yeah, this is just, and that's kind of the whole point of it. Like, you might have looked at this and you might have been like, okay, why, like, this is like a lot of trouble. Like, I can do that in React in like 2 minutes. Yeah, but you might spend 2 hours setting up React and getting Webpack working, and like your employees npm node version might be wrong or different or whatever. So, there's a cost there. So like, it's a bit more of a hassle to kind of, because you're working a lot closer to the metal, but like this like not having a build process is just insane. Not importing anything external. I mentioned early on that it very much feels like those early days with like GeoCities, where I kind of uploaded my first websites and so forth. I kind of get that feeling. But yeah, for any serious work, serious quote unquote here, I would probably pull something like React, just because I don't necessarily want to be working that close to the metal when I'm doing like really big interactive like web apps. What is the purpose of Polymer?
Polymer's
I
been
don't know,
discontinued, hasn't it?
Yes. So
been
Polymer has
graveyarded.
Yeah. So Polymer used to kind of function as a shim or a polyfill for a lot of this stuff, and when like all of this was kind of now natively supported in the browser, they were like, okay, so what now? So Polymer kind of started adding their own stuff, kind of becoming more like a library framework-ish thing. I don't know. No one really talks about Polymer anymore. I think de facto lit is kind of seen as the replacement for Polymer. Once again, lit is more a framework, so it kind of does use, I think it does a lot of, I'm not sure whether it does like a virtual DOM, but there is a bit of an abstraction between you and the actual DOM. So it does a bit of that. It has its own syntax, like JSX-like syntax, and so forth. So and it includes like state management and all of those things. So maybe I should talk about this a little bit. So obviously, between what I did, so where is what I did right now really useful? Where I find is really useful is as a stepping stone. I think especially with kind of some of the courses that I do, and so going from just like manipulating the DOM and doing basic like changing a button to green or whatever, and then jumping straight into something like React or whatever is, sure, that is a lot. That's a big jump. Now npm, node, transpilation, JSX, Webpack, what's the like ESBuild, Vite, styled components, like it's just like it's kind of that meme of how to draw an owl, where it's like draw 2 circles and step 2 finish the rest of the owl, and it's like this photorealistic owl drawing. It's kind of like that. It's just like this jump to like just like what would be very old. So I find it to be a really nice stepping stone on that way to kind of the React and the Angular and the Vue world.
That's a really good point, yeah, because because you're also working in a very similar component-based type of paradigm,
exactly,
which is one of the big jumps you need to make from kind of more traditional web stuff, where you're working on a page with a big CSS file, and maybe you're using Sass.
Yeah. What I also like about web components is, because you're working so close to the metal, is that you get really good at JavaScript. I'm biased to React. I really enjoy working with React, so I would say that React is maybe a bit better at this than like something like Angular, which does a lot of abstraction for you. All hate mail, please, down in the comments. But the point being that if you're using a framework or a library or whatever, you're kind of learning the like idiomatic language of that thing itself. So you're getting better at React, you're getting better at Angular, you're getting better at Vue. What's really nice about web components, because it's the actual web API itself, by doing things with web components, you're going to get better with JavaScript, period. Because it uses event listeners, it uses properties, it uses DOM nodes, it uses data attributes. So like, even if you just want to play around with web components to get better at JavaScript, that's even a very good use case. Another thing as well is, remember, because these are just effectively HTML now, you can actually use them in frameworks. So you can write web components, and then you can actually have, like, in React's a bit of a kind of tough one here. As much as I said, like, React's nice that it's kind of a lot lower level than Angular and so forth. One of the problems with React is it doesn't play that nicely with web components, but Vue and Angular and all of those, you can literally just use them as if they are native DOM elements. So this kind of element button that I created now, you can use it in Vue as if there's a native, in the way you would use an unordered list or a div or a button or a detail summary or, like a video player or whatever. So it's just HTML at the end of the day. You can even use it, and you have things like Stencil, which actually really lean into that kind of allows you, uses web components under the hood, and allows you to kind of write like components that can be used in any framework. They also tell you how to use it with React, but it does require just a bit of wiring up. But I know there are teams where they have various types of things. They have like, Vue things, or they have like Angular things, different frameworks being used by different teams. Or the actual marketing site is built on WordPress or whatever. And then web components is a really nice bridge where you can just import that script and just use it as if it's native HTML. Which kind of also like brings me to the last example where this is really useful, is if you have Django or you have WordPress or whatever, and this idea of like installing an entire like build process just to have like a little small widget somewhere in your server-side render templating or pages, there you can just do basic web component like I did just here and just pull it in via plain JavaScript. You don't have to have an adjacent like front-end build process with like transpilation and all of that stuff. So there, I think I did a talk, what was it, 3 years ago? When did I do my Preact talk? And
yeah, probably 3 years ago.
I think that was the second ever FEDSA talk. But I didn't even have a webcam then. So you were just looking at a static photo of me with my audio, with me talking. And if I were to do that talk now, I wouldn't have made it about Preact. I would have made it about web components, because I think web components now very much solve that problem that things like Preact and so kind of the kind of niche where they fit in, which is kind of like having like not drag and drop, but like drop in components that you can just add to like a WordPress site or something. Without like having to have like an entire like Webpack build or whatever, npm run start and so forth.
We actually had one of our maybe our 5th or 6th ever talk was on web components by Ben Janica years and years and years ago. It's amazing to see how from then to here how things have progressed.
And it was.
And he has an interesting comment.
That is really cool. I didn't know that. Oh, that's really cool. Thanks for that. Cool, that's going in the slides. But yeah, like I think like it's also like, oh man, I want to talk about that so badly, but we're already running up against 2 hours here. And
Yeah.
I've literally just shown how to do a basic button in web components. I've actually built entire apps in web components. I would love to show that. But like, it's just so much. And I would also love to kind of do a bit of a session in terms of kind of the history of web components, because it is such an interesting kind of journey. Like, the early days where we still had HTML imports, and then who was it, Firefox, that said like, no, we refuse to implement this, and they just like,
yeah, they did. That's why Google made Polymer.
Yeah, exactly. So it was just such a wild ride. So and no one could do anything about that, and they were just like, we're not going to implement this. Period. We're saying never, ever. So they were like, okay, cool, I guess we need to change this now, because there was one browser who effectively said they're never going to do this. And I think in retrospect, that was a good decision.
Yeah, and I agree.
Because
also Firefox had a much bigger browser market share back then.
Yeah, that is true.
I doubt that would happen now with Chrome WebKit being the juggernaut that it is.
Yeah, sure. Any last questions?
No, I don't think so. I think we should wrap there. On 2 hours exactly. Perfect.
Yeah, so I'm for anyone interested, if anyone's attending DevConf, I'm talking at the Cape Town. I'm talking at the Cape Town one and the Johannesburg one. If you're attending, please come say hi. Would love to chat to you. But also, I need your thoughts and prayers, because like my slot is 40 minutes. And I don't know how I'm going to cover anything useful in 40 minutes. Like, look at what happened over here. So, we'll see what happens there. I'm just going to make it do double speed.
Yeah, I did a typography talk at DevCon.
Sure, like that typography one.
Yeah.
Oh man, yeah, that's a solid 4-hour talk. That's like a workshop. That's
I had to cut out most of it, most of what I would talk about, and just think, well, what's actually going to be interesting to developers?
Yeah, but that's that's tough. Yeah,
legibility, not so much. CSS, JavaScript, font face observer, blah blah, that stuff maybe. Yeah, it's tricky. 40 minutes is nothing. Yeah. Well, for us when we get on our hobby horses. Anyway.
Yeah. On that note, we have 3 minutes to close it off.
Yeah. Thanks everyone. Thanks for attending. Takes about 24 hours for the video to render properly on YouTube. If you want to rewatch it, it'll be up on the channel for as long as Fedsa and YouTube exist. Hopefully a very long time. Thanks so much, Schalk. That was really great. Super informative. And yeah, seeing the demo and it all come together was really, really great. So thanks so much. And just another reminder, if anyone's still watching, that we are having, for that hackathon, we'll make some announcements on ZA Tech within the next couple of days. Cool. Thank you.
Cool. Cheers, everyone.